Hi, good morning, everyone. It's 10 a.m. on the West Coast of California. I'm Joe Adams. I'm an American immigration lawyer based in Los Angeles. If you've ever attended my webinars before, I'm always welcome any and all questions that you've got. So just put your questions in the chat. If you can't make it through the whole session, and we'll probably go about 30, 40, 35 minutes today, I'll send a recording of what we talked about today. Also, in preparation for today's session, I have a number of links and materials. So I'll put an email to everyone that registered so that you've got the links and the resources. There's a lot to cover, but like I said, usually the best discussions are coming from your questions. Yes, I'm an American immigration lawyer, and I focus on bringing people into the United States. I'm not qualified to say if you wanted to move to Canada, if you wanted to move to the United Kingdom, if you wanted to move somewhere else. That's not me. If you're looking for resources like that, I can occasionally refer people out to someone who's looking for non-U.S. Immigration. So the biggest thing in the news right now, of course, is the presidential election that is going to take place on November 5th. For people who are not from the U.S. or familiar with our system, every 4 years we have a presidential election. The presidential election is usually one of the most expensive, one of the most newsworthy items of an election year, and certainly in a charged moment like this, where up until recently we had the incumbent President Joe Biden up against former President Donald Trump. In my lifetime, no former one-term president has ever run for president again. When I was born, it was during the Carter administration, and President Carter is about to turn 100. He was a one-term president, sort of went into retirement, went into philanthropy, did work for Habitat for Humanity, took on sort of elder statesman's duties. He was the first one-term president in my lifetime. Then we had Ronald Reagan. He had served 2 terms. 2 terms is the maximum that a person can serve under our Constitution, 2 4-year terms. And then his successor was President George H.W. Bush, the father. He served a single term. And then after he lost his reelection bid to Bill Clinton in 1992, he sort of took on elder statesman's duties and sort of faded from public life. And then Bill Clinton, of course, served two terms, so 8 years total. And his successor was George H.W. Bush, the son, who served 2 4-year terms. And then his successor was, of course, President Barack Obama, 2 4-year terms. And then finally, President Obama's successor was Donald Trump. Donald Trump, of course, served a single 4-year term. And then his successor, President Joe Biden, beat him in the 2020 presidential contest. But since that time, former President Trump has remained in the spotlight, has remained very active, committed to running again in the 2024 cycle, which is unlike his predecessors who had won a single term. So that was the stage that was set. No serious challenger in the primary nomination contest to win the Republican nomination. No serious contender to win the Democratic nominating contest for President Joe Biden. And then, of course, everything changed a few weeks ago, responding to a drumbeat of calls for him to step aside. President Joe Biden announced that he would not be seeking a second term, and that in the same breath, within 20 minutes of announcing that fact that he would not be seeking a second term, endorsed his Vice President Kamala Harris, to be his successor. So very quickly, the Democrats in Congress, in the world of finance, in the society, coalesced around her, and very quickly Vice President Harris secured what she needed in terms of delegates to be the nominee of the Democratic Party. Since that time, both former President Trump and Vice President Harris have announced their running mates, the people who would become vice president should they win. In the United States, president and vice president run as a ticket. So when I fill out my voter card, you're voting for Trump and Vance, or Harris and Walz, or someone else. You don't select president and vice president separately. There's an interesting history of that in American political history, but in the modern era, we select our president and vice president as a single choice. I wanted to cover some basics for people who may not know. One question that comes up frequently is who can vote? And in federal U.S. elections, only U.S. citizens can vote. So if you were not born in the United States and you do not have a naturalization certificate, if you are not eligible for a U.S. passport, you are not allowed to vote. And unfortunately and sadly, there is a long string of cases where well-intentioned, good-natured people who were just enthusiastic about their candidate voted in elections that they were not allowed to. And what that means legally is that they made a false claim of citizenship. And that's an extremely dangerous proposition. Any false claim of U.S. citizenship in elections, in employment, can have extremely dire consequences for foreign nationals. There was a well-known case of a lady who was a permanent resident, a lawful permanent resident of the United States. She had her green card and was excited about her candidate. I don't think there was any sort of malintent in her mind. I just think she didn't understand the rules. And unfortunately, she cast her ballot. That was discovered, and she was deported for that error. And it's heartbreaking to read something like that, because you want people to be engaged in civic life. You want people to participate. When I have consultations with people who are lawful permanent residents of the United States who have their green cards, and they are discussing becoming naturalized U.S. citizens, one of the things I talk about as a benefit to becoming a naturalized U.S. citizenship is full civic participation in U.S. civic life. You can vote, you can serve on juries, you can sponsor your parents in ways that are different than the ways permanent residents can sponsor their other family members, and it's the last stop on the train. I'm a U.S. citizen because I was born in the United States. In the Western Hemisphere, the law typically follows place of birth as opposed to ancestry. In the old world, in Europe, for instance, a lot of those jurisdictions follow ancestry. So, if your grandparents were French and your parents were French and you're born, you're French. In the United States, regardless of who your parents were and regardless of how they got here, due to the 14th Amendment, which, remember, was a post-Civil War, post-slavery amendment that was passed into law in the 1860s, every human being who's born in the United States is automatically a U.S. citizen. And what's the difference between a U.S. citizen who was born in the United States and a U.S. citizen who naturalized? Nothing. There is no difference between my citizenship and the citizenship that I help acquire for my clients. None whatsoever. So it's full participation in U.S. civic life. It's not a tiered system of citizenship. Okay, so that's who can vote. Now, if you are excited about one candidate or the other, there are ways you can participate in the election that are not voting. So if you are a permanent resident of the United States and therefore have your green card, you are allowed to volunteer for campaigns. You are allowed to work for campaigns. You are allowed to donate money to campaigns. We have a very expensive system in this country. After the scandals of the Nixon administration, there was a series of campaign finance reform that took place, where there were strict limits imposed on how much money a person could contribute. Those are set by rules. I'll send the Federal Election Commission chart for the contribution limits for 2023 and 2024. But in this cycle, each individual is allowed to donate up to $3,300 to their campaign of choice. So it's a substantial amount of money, and hence these are campaigns that will sometimes raise millions and millions, if not billions of dollars. I think the Harris campaign just announced that they had the single largest grassroots fundraising effort in the month of July, after the the quick change up between Biden and Harris, and many of those will reflect people maxing out at the $3,300 limit. But if you are a permanent resident and a green card holder or a citizen, you can make a $20, $100, $500 contribution if you so choose. If you are not a permanent resident, if you are not a U.S. citizen, you can still do things like volunteer. You can still do things like phone banking, door knocking. When I was a young student, I worked with a lot of campaigns myself, where especially in state and local elections, working with the candidates, working with their hired staff, knocking on doors in the neighborhood, getting the word out to support the candidate of my choice. Nowadays, a lot of that work is done virtually. A lot of that work is done over your cell phone, over text message. I would imagine that many people on this call have received politically generated text messages. That seems to be the communication method of choice for a lot of campaigns. So that's who can vote. That's who can give money. That's who can be involved in campaigns for state, local, and of course the federal office. If you are a U.S. citizen and you want to vote, you must register to vote. This is an area that causes confusion for a lot of people, and I want to make sure to address it. So in our federal system of government, there are some things that are the province or jurisdiction of the national or federal government. Immigration policy is part of the national or federal government. It's the U.S. Congress that decides what our immigration laws are, and it's up to the president and his or her administration to decide how those laws are going to get enforced. When it comes to elections are the province and jurisdiction of state governments, and there's confusion here. So the federal government sets some basic ground rules. People over the age of 18 can vote. People can vote in national elections, but then it's up to each individual state and usually the local government, the county government, to implement the voting mechanism. So each state has its own rules, and they're all a little bit different about how you register to vote. What I'll do after the call is ended, I will send around a link from the National Association of Secretaries of State, which has each state's voter registration procedures. I just looked it up this morning in preparation for today's call. In California, where I'm based, in order to vote in the federal election on November 5th, you must have either postmarked or electronically submitted your voter registration no later than October 21st, 2024. Why don't we have same-day registration? I don't know. In this modern era, it really frustrates me that you can't just walk up to your polling place and say, hey, here's my identification. I want to register to vote. So register to vote if you are eligible, if you are a US citizen. Me personally, I vote in every election, and I am a permanent, in California, I am a permanent vote by mail person. So in the old days, you'd have to have a special accommodation. Maybe you were disabled, maybe you were elderly. Nowadays, at least in my jurisdiction, they mail the packet to me in the regular US mail. I take my time, I research the different issues and candidates. In California, we usually have a lot of what we call statewide propositions. Shall we impose a tax to improve this water system? Shall we impose this tax to give money to this school program? Shall we legalize recreational marijuana? Shall we eliminate the death penalty in California? Those are things that have been subject to statewide referendum. So I like to take my time and research the issues and look at the pro and the con positions, and then mail in my ballot. Laurent has raised his hand, and I'm going to click the button to allow him to talk. Laurent, you asked, what about green card cases? Do they vote? No. So unfortunately, well, for better or worse, I don't know that I would have a strong position on this. People who have green cards, people who are permanent residents of the United States, are not allowed to vote in presidential elections. After we hang up, I will send a link from the Association of Secretaries of State about voter eligibility. And you can see for yourself that you can see for yourself if you are able to vote. There are some jurisdictions, a very small number of them, that allow green card holders to vote in local elections only. So I do not want anyone to ever make a mistake and accidentally vote in a federal election where they are not allowed to if they are a permanent resident of the United States and have a green card. Just as a matter of terminology for people who may not know, if you have a green card, you are a lawful permanent resident of the United States. It's sort of like an in-between status. You might have someone who comes to the United States as a tourist or as a temporary worker. I file a lot of visas that allow people to work in the United States on a temporary basis where there's a fixed end date. And when they approach that end date, they either need to file something new or they need to depart, because you would not want them to be here unlawfully. Then there's U.S. citizenship, which, like I said before, is naturalized U.S. citizens have the same rights, responsibilities. They are fully incorporated into society as born citizens are, like myself. And then there's sort of a middle stage, which some people use for the rest of their lives, where they are lawful permanent residents of the United States. When a person is a lawful permanent resident, LPR, they have a document with them called which we informally call a green card. The fact that it's green is sort of an interesting trivia to me, at least. Back in the 1930s, green ink was hard to reproduce. It was hard to forge. It was hard to make. So the U.S. government used green ink to print the cardstock to show that a person was a permanent resident of the United States. And the government asked that permanent residents keep their green cards with them, in their pockets at all times. Nowadays, it's a plastic card with biometrics in the magnetic stripe and a lot of very sophisticated security features, many of which are not publicly discussed or publicly known, but they still retain that green ink on that plastic credit card size document. So if someone is a green card holder, they are a permanent resident. Lawrence, I see that you still have your hand up. Did you have any other questions? Yeah, you said the color of dollars too. That I should look that up. I like this kind of. I'm such a geek. I love this kind of trivia. Um, uh, Maybe I don't know. One criticism I've heard over the years about our greenbacks, our U.S. dollars, is that as compared to other currencies, our currency uh, is it's not as bright, colorful, pretty as other currencies are. So we have that green color. Maybe it's probably a good hunch. I'll have to get back to you on that. Okay, so that's who can vote. That's who can give. I'll send some resources for people to look that up for themselves. Now, the main topic I wanted to cover in today's session is what does this mean? What does this election mean for immigrants or people who are looking to immigrate into the United States? We have two very different candidates in Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. They have very different positions on a whole host of activities. Like I said at the beginning, this is the first time that a former president who won a first term but lost a second term has, in my lifetime, run for a new term. So the voters in the United States, myself included, have the 4 years of the Donald Trump administration to compare back to. Typically, when there is a challenger or there's a newcomer, it'll be a U.S. senator like Barack Obama was, or a governor like Bill Clinton was, or George W. Bush was. So it's very unusual to have a former president in the presidential contest. And then, up until a few weeks ago, it was going to be the sitting president versus his immediate predecessor. Now it's going to be the vice president, the number 2 person in the country, under the current administration, against the former. So these two records are pretty easy to compare and contrast. When we look at Kamala Harris's positions on immigration, first we have to start with the fact that she was my U.S. senator in California. Remember, her rise to political prominence started in San Francisco. She was born in Oakland, California, in the East Bay, raised there. She went to Howard University, which is a historically Black college in the DC metro area, and then moved back to California and went to UC Berkeley for law school. I'm also a proud graduate of the UC system, both for college and for law school. And then she became a district attorney in San Francisco, and then was the elected district attorney in San Francisco, and then became the statewide attorney general of the state of California, sort of the lead prosecutor, the lead criminal prosecutor, civil prosecutor for the entire state of California. And if you think about it, California's economy is on par in GDP numbers with Japan. It's larger than Germany. It's larger than the United Kingdom. So when you talk about California, California really could be its own state with very different regions, economies, a very diverse population, many languages spoken, 4 major metropolitan areas by my count, and so to be the top, to be the attorney general of the largest state, what was it? I think a very important job. And then of course the voters of California from I guess promoted, I don't know if that's the right word, elected her to be the United States senator when there was a long-serving senator named Barbara Boxer who decided to retire, and she retired, and then Kamala Harris won that election against her Republican opponent, and then she was the U.S. senator for several years, and then she became Joe Biden's running mate 4 years ago. So she's had a number of different jobs, all in public service, and all with a sort of a law enforcement background. So in that world of enforcement, one area that comes up is immigration and customs enforcement. Within the Department of Homeland Security, there is an organization called ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. for people who are very for people who, I'm trying to say this as deferentially as I can, for people who are skeptics about immigration, who do not like immigration, who are very concerned about people in the United States who are here unlawfully. There are people who favor ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. For people on the other side who thinks that there's a perception that ICE is overly zealous in the way it enforces immigration rules, that they go after the wrong people, that the people who are here unlawfully, especially the people who have been here unlawfully for a long time or who were brought here as young children who had no control in the matter, should not be targeted by ICE. Have actually called for the abolition of ICE and a reforming of immigration enforcement through a different agency, through a different mechanism. And they just want to start over from scratch. Kamala Harris does not advocate for the abolition of ICE. She wants to reform ICE, but she does not advocate its abolition. On the other hand, the head of the union of ICE workers, so ICE officers are U.S. government employees. They have a labor union that represents them. The head of that union is very pro-Trump. I don't think that comes as much of a surprise. When Harris talks about immigrants and in the popular discourse in media and in social media, there's a lot of focus on what we call the dreamers, the people who came to the United States as children who didn't have any control over the matter. Maybe they were very young, maybe they were little kids, maybe they were teenagers, but in any case, they came to the United States as children, usually with one or both parents, and they only know the U.S. as their home. They speak English, they go to public school, but they don't have a green card, they don't have permanent residency, and right now they don't have a pathway to become a naturalized U.S. citizen. There are about 12 million or so people who are in the United States unlawfully. Our country has about 330 million people total. So of that 330 million, 12 million, 12 million is a lot. And one thing that Donald Trump has advocated is that anyone who is here unlawfully should be deported. There were similar programs under the Eisenhower administration, especially in the southern United States. The name of that program has such a racist, you can look it up, has such a racist name that I won't repeat it here. You could look it up. The prior program rounded up people who were suspected of being here unlawfully, which, how do you know if someone's here unlawfully? One of the points I always try to make to people who are in the law enforcement side of things is, under our Fourth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, every human being has a right to be protected against unreasonable searches and seizures from the police, from law enforcement, from immigration officers. So in order to overcome that Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, a police officer and immigration officer must have probable cause or reasonable suspicion to think that someone has committed a crime. So for instance, if a person is driving along the highway and they're veering from one side of the road to the other and cutting through lanes, and maybe you look inside, the police officer looks inside the car and they see that the person is maybe bobbling their head, that police officer would form a probable cause or a reasonable suspicion that that person might be intoxicated. And that would be a justified reason to pull the car over. And if the police officer was satisfied that there was a reason to think that the crime of driving under the influence had occurred, then that would be a probable cause, a reasonable suspicion to put the person into custody and charge them with DUI, driving under the influence, drink driving. In the world of immigration, how do you get probable cause or reasonable suspicion that someone is undocumented? you can't just look at someone and know that they are undocumented. If they start speaking to you in a language that's not English, that's not probable cause. People speak many languages. Here in Los Angeles, there's a Russian Jewish community. There's a huge Latino populations of very different Latino populations from Mexico, Peru, El Salvador, Guatemala, Venezuela. There are people from all parts of Asia who speak their native languages. That's not probable cause that someone is here unlawfully. And then if they speak English and they speak English with, say, an accent, that's not probable cause. There are a lot of U.S. citizens and green card holders who speak with accents that are different than my accent. So I find all that law enforcement business to be pretty suspect under the Fourth Amendment, and I get pretty irritated when people talk about these kinds of ideas that we're going to round up people, based on what, other than just a racist perspective, that the person has a skin tone or an accent or doesn't speak fluent English or much English at all. That's not a reason to think that someone's committed a crime. Like I said, I'm trying to be fair, but you can see where my perspectives are. So one thing that Vice President Harris has advocated for, as have President Obama, President Biden, is providing a path to citizenship for people who came here as children. During the Obama administration, President Obama tried to pass a measure through Congress, but passing immigration legislation is very complicated, and getting consensus on immigration, even when the Republicans are totally in control or the Democrats are totally in control, or there's a compromise, getting anything passed is very difficult. It's very politically charged. So President Obama could not get legislation passed to provide a path to citizenship for the dreamers, for the young people who had come here through no decision of their own when they were children. So he passed an executive order, which has been subject to a lot of court challenges, but it is still the law of the land, called DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, DACA. So some people on this call might be DACA recipients. It basically says, if you don't have a complicated criminal history, if you provide your information, your contact information to the government, I'm simplifying this, of course, you can get a work permit and a travel permit, so that you can be more incorporated and not under the radar in terms of society. But that's not a permanent fix for DACA people. And what you see is, a lot of people who came to the United States when they were children in, say, the 1980s, 1990s, they're now having families of their own. They have U.S. citizen children, maybe they're married to a U.S. citizen. Because they entered unlawfully, that creates a lot of jeopardy for them. One thing that President Biden announced in the last few months is what's called parole in place. If anyone wants to talk about that in greater detail, we can, but basically parole in place, the formal rules haven't been announced yet, but pretty soon there will be a mechanism so that the people who arrived here unlawfully will have a more streamlined process to normalize their status if they are, say, married to a U.S. citizen, but did not enter the United States through normal channels. Say they crossed through the desert, as opposed to through an airport or a land crossing. One thing that comes up in the politics, and we've already seen this in the political discourse in the national media, Kamala Harris, when they came into office, and I want to talk about this from a personal perspective. When I was an immigration lawyer in 2017, early 2017, when Trump came into office, no one knew what was going to happen. He had some pretty caustic rhetoric around the subject of immigration. If you remember, he wanted to ban, and I wish I'd never had to say this, he wanted to ban anyone entering the United States who is coming from a Muslim majority country. And I had a few people caught up in this that was quickly resolved in the courts and withdrawn. but he wanted to ban all Muslims from entering the United States. And again, like the citizenship thing, like paperwork, how do you know if someone's Muslim? Just by looking at them. I just think it's absurd. But so the lesson of those 4 years, the lesson of the 4 years of Trump being in office, from my perspective, was that for all of the grumbling and grousing and late night tweeting that would go on, Trump was pretty ineffective at doing anything on immigration. He had a right-hand man focused on immigration, a very unusual person. If you've never heard the name Stephen Miller before, consider yourself lucky. He's a very unusual person, grew up in Santa Monica, Jewish guy, but has a real, I'm sorry to say, a real militaristic, almost Nazi-like streak to him. And he's very racist and very anti-Muslim. And he was Trump's right-hand man. Now, Stephen Miller was not an immigration lawyer. So what would happen was Miller would make these pronouncements from the White House. It would be in language that was hard to understand, and courts would usually make pretty quick work of it. What happened was that the immigration bureaucracy hollowed out. So remember, everyone from the low-level service worker who opens the envelopes and shuffles the mail at the immigration service, all the way up to the service center directors, all of those people are civil service workers. My mom was a civil service worker for her career. She could not be hired or fired by the politicians who ran the agency. The politicians who are elected set policy. It was the job of the workers to carry out the policy as best they could. But if the politician didn't like someone in the immigration bureaucracy, or they didn't think they were loyal enough or anti-immigrant enough, they couldn't be hired or fired on that basis. It's pretty hard to fire a civil service worker. They've got unions. They've got a complicated series of rules for hiring and firing. So what happened was, during those 4 years of Trump, during the first 3 years or so before COVID, a lot of immigration workers would just be frustrated. They're there to do a job. They're being told to do things that they know aren't legal, that are confusing, that are overly hostile towards the immigration population, and that they knew would be kicked out of court, especially the more senior officers. So a lot of those more senior officers just took early retirement. They went into the private sector. Someone with a lot of experience in the government is pretty valuable. In the private sector to have that experience. So a lot of law firms hired those workers. And then when COVID hit, the number of immigration applicants plummeted. The Immigration Service is 99.5% funded by the filing fees that you pay. So the revenue went way down. There was $1 billion budget gap during COVID, and the Trump administration suggested that they would furlough all the workers with a few weeks of notice. So if you hadn't left by then, you were certainly looking for the door now. Congress came in, bailed out the Immigration Service at the 11th hour. The furloughs never took place, but the damage was done. And so what happened in those first 3 years, and then the fourth year with the COVID furlough issue, is that the immigration bureaucracy hollowed out, and there were an enormous number of unfilled positions. What does that do? COVID's ending, people are getting their vaccines, travel's restarting. It was a car crash of a backlog. So typically pre-COVID, there'd be about 1 million immigration cases filed per year processed through the immigration system. COVID, that number drops down to a few 100,000. Biden takes office, Biden-Harris take office, 1.8 million case backlog they inherit. So one issue that politicians bring up, and it's brought up in the news, is They say that Vice President Harris was they call a border czar. Well, we don't really have that. That's not a government term, and that's not a government office that she ever held. What happened was that when the Biden-Harris administration came into office, they were inheriting this giant mess of a hollowed-out immigration bureaucracy. We had many people who had claims of asylum who wanted to, and remember, making a claim for asylum is a right. It's a right embedded in US law and in treaty. It is a fundamental human right to go to another country and request asylum if you fear persecution in your home country. There's a complicated series of rules about it and what countries can you go to and how do you get here. But the bottom line is that you have a right to claim asylum. And so there was a huge number of people, especially people from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, the triangle countries, sometimes referred to, where there's the conditions are very bad, where young men, young boys, teenagers are forced into the drug trade. Many young girls and women are forced into prostitution. So what do? If you leave. So there were a lot of people from those triangle countries, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, were basically just sort of hanging out directly below the US-Mexico border in the border towns. I actually visited one of these communities in connection with a charity that I help run. And they're making the best of a bad situation, but the conditions are pretty grim. They're basically improvising shelters out of garbage, tarps, corrugated metal, no traditional plumbing or sewage. There'll be a washing machine that just empties its dirty fluid into the street. It's pretty grim. When we visited that community, the little kids were playing soccer on a football, European football, on a busted little sort of curb of the street. We tried to fix that. We built them a little grassy park with some AstroTurf, but it was pretty bleak. So that's the condition. That's the condition that those people are in. What President Biden assigned Vice President Harris to do was look at the root causes of this situation. What are the root causes of migration from these triangle countries to North America? And can we, as a region, as a hemisphere, adopt some policies that improve the lives for those migrants who are seeking refuge because the conditions in their home countries are so bleak? So that was what Vice President Harris was assigned with. That's been transformed, especially in conservative media, to say that she was a border czar. That's just not a thing. The closest thing to a border czar was a lady named Roberta Jacobson. She was part of the transition team when Biden-Harris came in. So there's a transition between the election and when the new administration comes into office. So say we have our election coming up November 5th, 2024, and whoever the next president is will take office January 20th. So during that few months, that's what's called the transition. So Roberta Jacobson was part of the transition. She recently talked to the New Yorker magazine, and she said there was no process for decision-making at Homeland Security, DHS, and the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which runs our asylum program, was in disarray. She said the process, quote unquote, was that Stephen Miller, this very strange person, would hold calls with the civil service staff and shout at them and yell at them, and then they would try to do what he said. So they inherited a mess, and so that's what we're coming up against in terms of the politics. We've got on the one hand Trump, and I'm saying this not because I don't like Trump. I don't like Trump. I think he's a terrible person. But the record, the Trump record, is a record of chaos, of mismanagement, of lack of leadership. That is the record objectively. Whether or not you like Trump, what he left in terms of immigration was a mess. In terms of Harris, what she's talking about is a pathway to citizenship. I had a chance to meet Vice President Harris. The first time I met her was when she was running for Senate, and I had a brief conversation with her. Anytime I meet a federal official or someone running for office, what I always want to, if I've got 15 seconds, I want to say we really need to improve and modernize the U.S. immigration system. The U.S. immigration system, if you don't know, it's still in the world of paper filings. It's still in the world of mailed documents. It's still in the world of people who go for their immigration medical exams provide me with a sealed paper envelope where the physician has signed over the seal. This is 2024. Why are we doing this? It's so prone to human error. I just took on a case, which we're probably going to file in federal court next week, where a school official with a student visa made a typographical error, didn't catch the error until it was too late, and it's caused a huge amount of chaos for this person, who should have a work permit for the next year, doesn't, and there's no easy fix because the systems are not efficient. We're going to have to file a lawsuit in federal court. It's going to be expensive. Why do we need to do this? So anytime I have a chance to meet with an elected official or someone running for office, I'm a part of an advocacy group, a lobbyist group called the American Immigration Council, and a different one called the Immigrants List, and we meet with elected officials. So when I met with then Senate candidate Harris, who was our Attorney General at the time, in my 15 seconds, I said, look, if you get to the Senate, we really need some oversight in immigration because the way it's run with paper filings and mailed documents, all this, prone to human error, we've really got to fix that. And I think the message has come through because that is something that she has advocated. If I could take any credit for that, I doubt it was just me. I think probably people who are more juiced in with her got the message across that Homeland Security, USCIS, the Immigration Service needs to be a streamlined, modern system, electronic filings, electronic notices to reduce error. So that is my presentation. If you have any other questions for me about the elections, about U.S. immigration, let me know. I'll send the resources I mentioned to you. Also, this is brand new, and you are the first to know. I've created a Reddit group. I don't know if you use Reddit or not. Reddit is a very interesting website that allows different communities, some 200,000 communities, to chat, discuss, to share information. The immigration Reddits, there's a few of them, but none of them focus on O1 visas, EB1 green cards, the high achiever immigration status that I do. I wrote a book earlier this year called Extraordinary Aliens, 12 people who pursued wealth, fame, and the American dream. In it, my editor, John, and I were able to chat with the actual members of Congress who wrote the rules back in the 1990s when I was a little kid that we use today to get actors, models, dancers, entrepreneurs, physicians into the United States under this special extraordinary ability category. So it was long overdue to write the book. I'll send a link if you're interested in getting that book off Amazon. And then the other breaking news, and this is this is how we can keep the discussion going, is there is now a Reddit channel, which I called O1 Visas EB1 Green Cards, r/O1 Visas EB1 Green Cards. And I'll put a link in the email that I send to everyone after I hang up, to just get some discussion going, to collaborate, to share, to, what's working for you? What do you have questions about? What's that rumor that you just heard? So I will put a link to all that. I really appreciate everyone sticking in for the 50 minutes that we were on. If you have any other questions, just let me know. Thanks so much, guys.